Good afternoon, everybody. I have to say that as I've sat through the previous few presentations, I've been struck by what now feels to me like the genius and the creativity of the ESARP staff for bringing in speakers whose work very much complements each other's. And I took some notes so that I could kind of build on what's been said already this morning. I couldn't agree more with Doug Fisher when he said, and I'm quoting him now, "Some things we do have harmful effects on our students." And following along in that theme, Roseanne Bosch recently, she's described as someone who questions entrenched cultures and practices. And this morning she said, and I'm quoting her here, "Sometimes what we're doing is not right." And I couldn't agree with both of them more. I'm going to bring that to a whole new level this morning, and I have news for you. It's not good news, but I do have news also that I think there is promise ahead of us if we can collaborate and make the changes that I think are a moral imperative for so many students in our schools. So with that, I'd like to begin by quoting one of my favorite authors, E.M. Forster. Wrote a book back in 1910. It's called Howard's End. You might have seen it as a Broadway film as well. But in that book, in Howard's End, E.M. Forster says, and I'm quoting him here, "Live in fragments no longer, only connect." Let me say it again. Live in fragments no longer, only connect. With that quote, I invite you first to connect with me. For the next hour or so, to connect with the material that I present, as provocative as it is, and to join me in a mission that I'm on, is trying to change the culture of these kinds of schools. I also invite you with that quote to connect with each other. And I don't mean that, in 3 months this exact collection of individuals will come together again, although that would be nice. What I mean is that if schools are going to move in the direction of what I'm calling developmentally empathic changes on behalf of the developing children and adolescents in our schools, then that's not a job for the students themselves to do. That's a job for us to do. This is adults' work. And if adults don't engage more fully in this work, the students will continue to suffer, and that will make more sense to you as I proceed in this presentation. And finally, with this connection quote, I invite you to think about trying to connect with your students on a level that you've never really thought of before. And by that I mean at the synaptic level of their own neural development. If we truly connect with what's actually going on inside their living brains at every stage of their own growth and development, then we'll begin doing the right thing by them. There's a wonderful author, David Elkind, who wrote a book you may recall. He actually wrote 3 versions of it. The book is called The Hurried Child. David Elkind wrote the first version of that book in 1981 to try to define what he then believed to be and knew to be the hurried practices of trying to move children through their developmental phases before they were actually ready to do that. And then in 1991, David Elkind published the 10th anniversary of that book, because what it meant to be hurried as a child in 1991 was already dramatically different and more dangerous than it had been just 10 years earlier. Well, Elkind wrote the 25th anniversary of that book in 2006. That was 12 years ago. In 2006, he wrote it as again to say that the problems for rushing children through their development and expecting more of them than they're capable of actually doing and achieving is becoming even more dangerous. In that book, in that 25th anniversary edition, Elkind says, and I quote here too, "The human brain is the ultimate scientific authority." And I again couldn't agree with him more, and I'm going to show you some slides today that hopefully will convince you that that's actually true, and that our job is to get in sync with the human brain and not try to overpower it and push it through development before it's ready to be pushed. The truth is that the human brains, whether it's mine or yours or anybody else's in history, they develop on their own schedule. And our job is to get in sync with that. So one of the advantages of being a psychologist in schools for the last 30 years that I've seen specific trends that have been striking to me, each one kind of in rough decade periods. I started my work as a psychologist in a very elite New England private school in 1994. I was a newly minted psychologist, and I was so eager to begin using the skills that I had trained in using and practicing through my years of graduate school. When I got to that school, I immediately engaged with that and started to be, a practicing psychologist and a therapist and trying to help kids who were in fact struggling. Anxiety and depression and the various manifestations of that were fairly common. But at that time in that school, it seemed like one of the most severe ways to have an expression or experience of anxiety or depression was for kids to manifest as in eating disorders. The school had a near professional ballet dance company, and they also had a very strong boys wrestling team, both of which were kind of catalyst programs that encouraged kids, to lose a lot of weight really quickly and to therefore compromise their own health. Not only that, but their own attention, their memory, their learning capacities. Well, as you know, those kinds of conditions don't just happen for people on the dance team and on the wrestling team, but there's a contagious effect to these kinds of conditions. And when kids learn that, oh, you lost weight like this, oh, you lost weight like this, then they try it too. And one of the ways that kids, kind of mimic each other is that they practice these things and it spreads. So from about 1994 until sometime in the early 2000s, my experience of the most severe ways to have anxiety and depression was that when kids would manifest those in behavioral ways, in the experience of eating disorders. Well, then something began to shift. One of the students that came into my office at that school was very, very bright, incredibly capable. She had won a scholarship to the school, not only for 4 years of tuition, but for 4 years of room and board. It was in a boarding school. There's no question about her intellectual or academic skills. But when she came into my office, she had written, not just written, but carved in her right forearm the words, "I suck." And it was still seeping a little bit of blood. And I thought that was an expression of suicidality. Turns out it wasn't. And it was an experience, my first experience clinically, of working with someone who had deliberately cut herself or himself. And cutting also takes on a kind of contagious effect. Part of the reason why it's addictive as a behavior is that when we cut ourselves, either deliberately or by accident, you know that one of the two ways that we can get an endorphin kick in our lives is by rigorous exercise, which is, of course, the best way to do it. But the other way is to have a wound. And if you're cut by accident or if you cut yourself, endorphins rush to the site of the wound, and they're basically your body's built-in painkiller system. And that begins to affect the experience of reduced pain. But what also comes with endorphin kicks is a slight chance, a slight experience of not quite euphoria, but just a little bit of, this is a break from the pain that I'm in. So part of the reason why cutting took off in another kind of contagious way with adolescents around the world is because when they were experiencing so much pressure, if they cut themselves repeatedly, they would feel predictably a sense of relief even temporarily, from the pressure they're experiencing on the inside. So that went on for quite a long time, and I could feel the tension building. And then somewhere about 10 years ago, there was another shift into a much more serious and more dangerous manifestation of anxiety and depression, and that was that more and more students were coming into my office and the offices of my colleagues complaining of suicidality and planning to take their own lives. I'm the consulting psychologist for a school in the Boston area where we've had 3 suicides in the last decade. I was in Hong Kong back in December, and in 2017, there were 69 teenage suicides in the school system of Hong Kong. That's on the average 1 every 5.3 days that a young person was taking his or her life. So when I started writing this book back in 2012, early 2013, I was stunned by the frequency and the patterns that had evolved. And my sole intention in writing this book was simply to try to empathize with the adolescents I had seen for so many years by then, as if they could collectively say, and I wanted to say on their behalf. I wanted to get the adults' attention. I wanted to represent the kids by saying, as if they could say for themselves, do you realize how hard this is? And more importantly, I could imagine this collection of adolescents screaming to the adults in their lives, to their parents, and to their teachers, how far do we have to push this until you get it, until you understand that there's something wrong here, and that we can't manage this much pressure all the time? When are you going to change? Well, at the same time that was the case, and I was starting to generate stories, I have files and files of stories, clinical situations with kids I've worked with over the years, and I was just trying to generate some composite stories to reflect those kids' interests and needs. And I was also doing some other training in a research paradigm, something called the immunity to change. And if we had a lot more time, I could go into much more detail about how that is. But it struck me, I'm struck by another of the lines that Roseanne mentioned a while ago, that we learn with our bodies. And our bodies, in fact, teach us information as well. I was out on a bike ride, and you know how sometimes some of your most creative ideas come to you when you're least expected. You're in traffic in the car, or maybe you're in the shower, or maybe you're out for a walk, or I was on a bike ride. And I realized that this list of symptoms that so many kids that I had seen and so many kids that I had known about around the world of being anxious and depressed and sleep deprived, and of cutting themselves, and of substance abusing, and of suicidality, that these symptoms fit in perfectly with this particular research paradigm that I wanted to use. So I rode home as quickly as I could, and my wife is a math teacher in a school, in a secondary school. In fact, just to establish some common ground, she and I are married 30 years this coming October, and for 24 of those years we lived on a boarding school campus, and for 21 of those years we lived in a dorm. So I understand and have lived with adolescents my entire professional life. In fact, we raised our 3 children at that school, and they all graduated from that boarding school. Of course, they lived with us. They didn't live in the dorm, although they did. They lived in the dorm because we lived in a dorm, but they didn't live in dorms on their own. And it wasn't like we lived in room 202 down the hall and shared a bathroom with 25 teenagers. We had rather spacious housing on campus in this beautiful school. Anyway, so I began to use this research paradigm to get at what I thought would be the case. So I asked my wife first to go through this particular series of interview questions called the immunity to change paradigm. And when I did that, she went exactly where I thought she would go. And then I did that again with 2 or 3 other schools in the local area as pilot studies, if you will. And I gave them the exact same questions that I'd given Amy. I didn't generate these questions. These are questions that come directly from this particular research paradigm called the immunity to change. So I want to, and they went there too. Every one of these people went there too. And since then, that was back in 2013 that I realized that this was happening. And I'd already begun speaking internationally, so I've been throughout Europe and Asia, and recently in South Africa, and I'm proud to say that this is my first foray into South America. But here's what people have said in response to these exact questions, and I'll tie this back to the adolescence that I spoke about at the beginning. So the paradigm takes a look at these symptoms, and they're basically complaints that we have. If you were to come in to my office and say that you wanted to work on something, you had a complaint about yourself that you wanted to try to address, then I would use this, and we're using the language of complaints in constructive ways. The idea being that people wouldn't complain about something they didn't actually care about. Does that make sense to you? You wouldn't complain about wanting to lose 10 pounds if on some deeper level your health didn't mean something to you. Or you wouldn't complain about wanting to be more patient with your spouse or with your partner or with your children if being more connected in relationship didn't mean something to you. So that's what struck me on my bike ride, was that these were complaints that people might actually have, I know they have them, about students in their schools, more and more of them, who are struggling in these really serious ways. So I put that list of complaints through the interview, and here's what I found. The way we get at what we actually care about is we take the list of complaints that we have and we try to invert it by answering a particular question. So I asked Amy, my wife, and I asked others, and I'm asking you because my guess is I won't be able to take your answers because of the format we're in, but my guess is you'll imagine some of the same responses. So the first question is, in light of these complaints, and again, the complaints would be things like, you have more students in your schools who are anxious and depressed and substance abusing and eating disordered and self-injuring and perhaps even committing suicide. In light of these complaints that you have, that these things are intensifying, complete the following statement. And the statement is, I am, or we as a school are, committed to the value or the importance of blank. And here's what people around the world have said. They said, I am, or we as a school are, committed to presenting our students with an appropriate balance of challenge and support. We're committed to challenging our students to intellectual and personal growth with an appropriate level of rigor. There's that word rigor again. We're committed to an authentic engagement with our students. We're committed to meeting our students where they are. We're committed to educating our students in healthy, safe, and balanced ways. We're committed to supporting our students' mental and physical health. We're committed to promoting a healthy school culture. I could go on and on. But does that make sense? If those are the things that you're committed to, then of course you'd be complaining about the fact that more and more students are showing these signs of anxiety and despair. So at the end of this particular question, everybody feels pretty good about themselves because they've just been able to, in a sense, reaffirm their earliest commitments and probably the reason why they went into teaching in the first place. There isn't one of us in this room that went into teaching to hurt students, not one. But as both our earlier speakers spoke about, sometimes we do things in schools that are harmful to children, and quite frankly, we don't always know that we're doing it. So the next part of the interview asks a very specific question, and it says, so in light of the commitments that you've just made and articulated to healthy, safe, and balanced education, and to promoting a healthy school culture, and to meeting your students where you are, and indeed you mean that, this is a kind of self or institution implicating question, and it says, what are you actually doing in your schools that's getting in the way of your commitments to healthy, safe, and balanced education? What are you actually doing that's getting in the way of your commitment to promoting a healthy school culture? And here's what they said. These are, again, very earnest people, just like every one of you. They said, we overschedule our students and we compress too much activity into an inadequate number of days and weeks. We always seem to pile on more, but we're never willing to do less. There's no give. We stretch our students too thin. We're constantly adding things to our schedule, and we never take anything away. We over-focus on the college admissions process. It's all about college. We assign too much homework. We label and categorize many of our non-achieving students. We describe them as having ADHD or some executive functioning problem, and we still enforce our own very high standards as non-negotiable. We place too much emphasis directly and indirectly on grades. This is one of my favorites. We expect our students to think like adults and to act like adults before they are adults. Here are some of the things that they don't do. We don't follow reasonable guidelines for homework, no matter what we say. We're not really inclined to meet kids where they are. We don't empathize enough with our students. We don't compromise on academic rigor. That is our currency. We don't find opportunities to recognize the middle achievers. We overemphasize achievement more than effort. So, they don't feel that good about themselves after they've kind of told on themselves, they've implicated themselves, but they are being earnest and honest, and I encourage them at this point in the interview to stick with me because things are going to get better, but in a sense they have to get worse before they get better, and that has something to do with what this immunity to change process is all about. So I asked them, imagine, if you could, that you didn't do those things. Imagine if you were to do the opposite of those things. If you didn't assign all that homework, if you didn't over-focus on the college process, if you didn't over-schedule to the extent that you do, if you didn't do all those things, what worries or fears would come up for you? What would you be concerned about if you didn't do those things? And maybe you've imagined what they've said, but here's what they've said. If we didn't overschedule and assign too much homework and reinforce overachievement, then we'd be seen as having lost our standards and lacking in rigor and excellence. If we didn't do all those things, then we'd lose our standing as an elite school that gets kids into selective colleges. If we didn't do all those things, then we would be perceived as intellectually soft. If we didn't, then our students wouldn't get into good colleges, and eventually we would lose our jobs. If we didn't do all those things, then we fear that maybe we've been wrong all along. Here's one from the head of a school in the New England area, one of New England's most prestigious independent schools. He said, if we didn't do all those things, then our reason for being would cease to exist. The value of our diploma would plummet, and no one would want to attend a school with such low academic standards. This is one that truly gets to me in terms of the developmental piece. Another senior administrator at a very impressive American independent school said, this is the direct quote, if we actually gave in, listen to that, if we gave in, and a developmentally reasonable schedule emerged, we might achieve a healthy balance for our students at the cost of our own distinctiveness. We might lose our edge of excellence and become a vanilla school. And who would want to come to a vanilla school? By now, you can probably feel the tension that the adults are experiencing. These well-intended, decent, caring, devoted adults who have invested their lives to educating are themselves in a bit of a bind. At the same time that they are deeply and earnestly committed to healthy, safe, and balanced education and to meeting their students where they are, because of the pressures that they experience, pressures that parents are imposing on them, that the culture is imposing on them, they find themselves doing all kinds of things that are actually harmful for the students they're trying to educate in healthy, safe, and balanced ways. And not only is it harmful, but they're afraid if they didn't do those things, then they would close. Then they'd lose their jobs. They're in a state of tension themselves. Well, this is an adult problem. This is not a problem that kids can solve. And the truth is, as adults keep doing these things that are harmful for kids in schools, who pays the dearest price? The students. The students who are anxious and sleep-deprived and depressed, and who are using their bodies to demonstrate and to manifest the intensity of the pressures that they're experiencing. They couldn't scream it any louder than with a behavior like suicide. Our job is to listen to that. So the last part of this interview is that I ask educators to say that in addition to being committed to these healthy, safe, and balanced ways and meeting students where they are and to promoting a healthy school culture, answer the following question: we may also be committed to blank. And here's what they say to that. We may also be committed to maintaining our reputation as an elite school. We may also be committed to protecting our brand. We may also be committed to not being perceived as intellectually soft. We may also be committed to pleasing parents. We may also be committed to emphasizing achievement over effort. We may be committed to keeping our jobs. We may be committed to making our budget. The immunity to change paradigm, it's named that because it's based on this basic principle that in the same exact way that every one of us in this room has an immune system that keeps us alive in the face of toxins and environmental conditions and viruses and so on, and it operates below our level of consciousness, and we never have to turn it on. You know, if we're coming into an environmental situation or if the virus is in the room, our immune system just kicks in physiologically, biochemically, and keeps us alive. That's what it's for. We don't have to ask it to work on our behalf. But in the same way, these authors, Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy are their names, they say that in the same way that we have these physiological immunities that keep us alive, we also have these psychological immunities that keep us alive. That there are ways of acting and ways of being and ways of thinking and ways of feeling that we've developed from very early stages in our own lives that made total sense then. They're things that kept us alive in the game of our own families, perhaps. They're things that we did and thought and in the ways we operated to keep ourselves going in light of what might have been family dynamics or other tensions in our environments that required that we do something to keep ourselves in the game of our own lives. And those things become kind of embedded and reinforced over time in such a way that when we want to make real changes in our adult lives, quite frankly, the things that get in the way of our ability to make those real changes are those things that once kept us alive but no longer are necessary, and that now we can afford to perhaps look at them. But if we can't expose them, we can't look at them. And what I think this interview did with schools around the world is it helped expose that at the same time well-meaning people are intended to educate their students in healthy, safe, and balanced ways. What they're now aware of, and perhaps what you're a tiny bit more aware of, is the immune system that they have, that if they don't overschedule their students, if they don't do all these things, then they're in some kind of trouble too. And that puts the adults in a sticky situation where it asks them to make changes. But it's really hard to make changes when they're afraid to do that, because if they're afraid to make these changes, their real fear is that their schools will close and that they'll be seen as intellectually soft and they'll feel like failures themselves. Well, this is truly an adaptive challenge for adults to work on. It's not for kids to work on. But my focus is on taking a look at the children themselves, because what's typically the course of action is that when we notice that students in our schools are experiencing anxiety and depression, or if they're acting those conditions out in some dangerous way, what do? We do what we think we're supposed to do. We send them to people like me. We send them to psychologists and to psychiatrists and to mental health counselors. And we say, and to other people, and we say, here, go get some help. We hope that works for you. We ask them to take medications. We ask them to change. But we never look in the mirror and say, what are we doing in schools that has kids so stressed out and anxious and depressed in the first place? It's not fair, from my perspective, to ask kids to be the only ones to change. That we adults have to change, and this is a pretty big deal. I want to show you some slides now that strengthen and reinforce the reasons why that's true. So, raise your hand if you recognize these characters. Anybody? A few of you do. The person on the left is Jean Piaget. The person on the right, now you know who it is? Yeah, there you go. And the person on the right is Erik Erikson. These were two of the many pillars of cognitive development and psychosocial development and other kinds of learning theories and social emotional theories that many of us were exposed to in undergraduate schools and in graduate schools of education and psychology. It turns out that both of these guys and all of the pillars like them, like Margaret Mahler and Sigmund Freud even, and Harry Stack Sullivan, and we could list a name of all the theorists whom we've studied, and they were all right. But neither one of them lived long enough to see what we can now see inside the living human brains of every one of these children and adolescents. So I want to show you some pretty compelling stories. First of all, Jay Geed is a psychiatrist who is in Baltimore, Maryland. He works at the National Institute of Mental Health in the U.S. I was in his audience once when he said, and I'm quoting, "Teen brains are doing just what they should be doing." I want to outline for you three major developmental truths about every single adolescent brain on the planet. The first thing that's happening at the onset of puberty is that the limbic system of our brains are turning on in a whole new way. It's always been there as a structure, and it's always been a little bit active. But because of the hormonal secretion that begins the process of puberty for every one of us, that limbic system is now supercharged with new hormones that make it operate in a much more intense way. It is the primary region of the brain responsible for emotional processing. This is why teenagers go from being sweet, innocent little children to all of a sudden, raging in their emotions. Or at least not necessarily raging, but experiencing and expressing emotions perhaps much more intensely than the situations demand. They tend to over-express. Their whole lives are driven primarily by emotions, and they're brand new to them in an intense kind of way. And this structure doesn't come on gradually. It comes on like 0 to 10 all on the same day. So at the same time that that's true, actually I want to back up. There's a story that I'd like to tell here that illustrates part of this in a kind of severe way. There are two researchers in a town near me, Belmont, Massachusetts, at McLean Hospital. It's a Harvard-affiliated psychiatry hospital. Their names are Anderson and Teicher, and they did what's called a meta-analysis, which is an analysis of numerous studies of children who had been subject to sexual abuse earlier in their lives. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old children who had been subjected to sexual abuse. And what they noticed in those studies was that those children, surprisingly, didn't show much of the emotional and behavioral effect. They didn't show the sequelae of having been abused sexually, sometimes once, sometimes on an ongoing basis. And it was like these children just kind of went numb after this abuse had occurred. And then what they also noticed as they did this longitudinal meta-analysis was that as those children entered puberty, they started suddenly to experience and express the intensity of the emotions that had once been affected by and associated with the abuse they had endured years earlier. And Anderson and Teicher postulated, and I agree with them, that the feelings of intense embarrassment and humiliation and shame and anger and fear and anxiety all were incubated until they had the brain structure, the anatomical structures to actually process the emotions that they didn't have experience of feeling then. So so many of them then became symptomatic with major experiences of anxiety and depression, and it took off from there. So at the same time for young adolescents that the limbic system is coming on board, the prefrontal cortex is just beginning to come on board. That's the part of our brain that we associated with executive skills, executive functions. Everyone knows something about that. What we now know from research that I'm going to show you, and you've heard about this already, is that the brain develops from the back to the front, so that the frontal part of the cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. We didn't know that a long time ago. People who, like Jean Piaget, when he was studying cognitive development, they didn't know that. And quite frankly, we didn't know until even more recently that the frontal lobe of the brain doesn't fully develop until the late 20s or early 30s. And do we have anybody in his or her late 20s or early 30s here? You're still developing. And that's a good thing. I hope this contributes in a positive way to your development. Anybody who's kind of in their 30s and 40s, not so, we're done. Not really, but we're not growing with the same kind of pace with which the younger generations are still developing. So here's the issue with this dichotomy. You can see already that there's a relationship between what's actually happening inside the limbic system, and it's come on full force, and now you've got this other structure of the prefrontal cortex that's supposed to be the brain's executive. Well, when you're 13 or 14 or 15 years old, and it's not going to fully develop until you're 30, well, you're not a very good executive yet. And yet you've got this really forceful and rather assertive and at times absolutely aggressive limbic system that's saying, come on, I want to do this now. And you've got this executive who doesn't know what to do, and it becomes overwhelmed, and this is one of the reasons why kids find themselves in extreme experiences of anxiety and depression, because they don't have a kind of structural part of their brain that can manage the intensity of the emotions that are being driven towards it. Well, the last major piece, there's a lot going on for the teenage brain, but the last major piece of growth and development for adolescents at puberty is that the term growth is actually redefined here. At the onset of puberty, every single child's brain has developed its full adult size. It's reached its peak volume. It's the same size then as it is now for us. It's filled the cranial cavity. It's filled our heads. It's grown with lots of gray matter. But now, growth takes on a whole new meaning. Growth is less about gray matter and volume and size and much more about white matter. White matter is neural pathways and neuro tracks. And when I started this talk, I asked you to think about connecting with your students at the synaptic level. And what I mean by that is that you know that every single action, every single thought, every single feeling, everything that we do has its own physiological and biological root in neurotransmission of our brains. And that neurotransmission is itself an electrochemical process that moves along one neuron, jumps across the synapse to the next one. That synapse, that jump, is itself one of the tremendous forces of life. The first time I ever dissected a recently harvested human brain, I held this brain in my hands and just kind of worshipped it as this beautiful tissue that had once, in the previous few months, been the storehouse of that person's entire life, of his or her memories, and his or her imagination and creativity, his or her appetite, his or her sexuality, his or her fears and hopes and dreams. Everything had its own, his or her walking and running and speaking and playing music or listening to music. Everything had been in this beautiful tissue, but the tissue was no longer animated by the neurotransmission that gave it life. And so this process is so magic. We call it white matter because white matter, neurons typically, because of their action, can anybody fill in this this line, neurons that fire together, wire together, thank you. That's a phrase that Donald Hebb coined a long time ago, 1949. Neurons that wire together, fire together, wire together. That's why if you do something over and over and over and over, and you practice and practice and practice and practice, it becomes intuitive. It becomes just what you do. Do we have any musicians in the room? I'm a guitar player. Maybe some people are piano players or violin players or piano players. When I started playing guitar, I was terrible. I was an 8-year-old boy trying to learn how to play the guitar. I'm actually not so bad right now. I'm 58 years old. I've been playing guitar for 50 years. So if you asked me to play the guitar right now, and I kind of wish I had one because I'd love to play for an audience like this. If I played a song I've been playing for 40 years, you'd say, wow, he's really good. Because my fingers kind of know how to do that. It became intuitive because of practice, practice, practice. But if you asked me to play a song I've never heard before and I had to read the music, that would take me longer. But I think I could figure it out because I'm familiar enough with the process. All that is to say that the neurons associated for me with playing guitar, certain songs, if you will, are pretty well established, and they've got a lot of myelin wrapped around them. And the more myelin there is wrapped around those neurons that help me put my fingers around guitar are pretty well developed. And the more myelin you have along any neuron associated with any behavior, the faster the electrochemical activity there is along that neural pathway, and the more intuitive the behavior is, or the more intuitive the thought is, or the more intuitive the feeling might be. Everything is based on this white matter. So now, white matter defines growth. But here's the piece that makes schools so important and play a pivotal role. White matter only develops in response to what's happening in the environment in which the brain actually exists. It's not as if you can download a new white matter program hard drive for your brain that's developed somewhere on another continent. White matter develops in response to the reciprocal interactions that the brain is having in the environment in which it exists. Some of that white matter happens because of thoughts that come from within, but a ton of it comes from reactions to the environment in which it's experiencing things back and forth. Make sense? Okay. So, we're getting to some of the most exciting part of this entire presentation. Jay Geed is that psychiatrist I mentioned to you a little while ago. About 25 years ago, he did a longitudinal study where he got 52 children, 52 families allowed their then 5-year-old children to be brain scanned in an MRI machine 4 times over the next 15 years. And he basically wanted to watch, these are typically developing children. These are not sick children, they weren't disordered children, they were just typical 5-year-olds, and their parents allowed them to remain in the study for the next 15 years. And then at the end of this 15-year period, Jay Geed created this time-lapse video that I'm going to show you. Hopefully the video will actually work. But I want to stop and tell you a little bit more about what you're going to see first. My pointer isn't working, so this first series of brain here, this is those brains. Those are composite brains at 8 years old. And then they go up 3 years from there. So as we go from left to right on this schemata, those brains are first 8 years old, and then the next 2 are composite brains of 11-year-old children, and then 14-year-old children, and then 17-year-old children, and then down the bottom, those are 20-year-old adults. So in this scheme, thanks. Thank you very much. In this scheme, the bluer the brain, the more white matter there is. Now there may be some confusion there. Brains are not blue. I know that. But these images are dye-enhanced brain density areas of white matter. So the more intense, the more developed the white matter is in those areas of the cortex, the bluer the image. Okay? That makes sense? All right. So I want you to pay attention to this, because this series of brains right here, these are composite images of 52 brains that are 14 years old. Look what part of the brain isn't fully developed yet. That's the frontal cortex. That's the one responsible for executive skills like time management and getting your homework done on time and organizing your desk and your materials and your space and being able to identify your emotions and express them appropriately and be able to inhibit impulses. And all of those things come from the prefrontal cortex. So let me tell you a story. When I was 14 years old, I was a very little boy. I was a 9th grader who looked much more like a 6th grader. I was 5 feet tall, maybe 5'1". I weighed maybe 100 pounds. I couldn't grow a beard. I was a little boy. But one of my friends in my 9th grade year was a guy named George. And George, I was a month older than George. I was born in April. George was born in late May of the same year. George was about 5'6" or 5'7". George could grow a full beard. George was already playing on the varsity football team of our school as a 9th grader. George was Herculean as a 14-year-old. I wasn't. There isn't a phys ed teacher or an athletic coach in the world who has a good conscience, who would pair George against me and me against George in an athletic contest for a grade. Because if that happened, I would fail every single time, and George would always win. We intuitively understand when we see 9th graders who look different. We intuitively grasp the fact that physical development is itself a variable experience. And children can be the same age and growing and developing at different stages in different ways. I haven't seen George in a long time, but I'm pretty sure that George and I are, we wouldn't think that we're so disparate anymore if we saw each other now. But here's the thing. Most 9th grade teachers and 10th grade teachers and so on expect all of their 9th grade students to be able to organize their materials and manage their time and space and manage their emotions effectively and inhibit impulses and get their work done on time and to execute all of these executive skills equally as if they just were granted this new toolbox when they turned 13 of executive skills and now they know how to use it. And then, unfortunately, we grade them if they don't know how to do these things. That would be like giving me a grade for being 5 feet tall instead of letting me just grow up on my own schedule. We expect this. We don't naturally intuit that adolescents are from a frontal lobe development, are developing in the same normal variation way. There's a speaker that I like a lot back in the States who speaks only about executive functioning, and he speaks to audiences like this, and he says, he's addressing all of these different things, and many times some parent will say, how long is it going to take before my kid is going to learn these kinds of skills? And his answer is always the same, and he always says, longer than you'd like, but bet on development. And he's right. Just because we expect kids to be able to do these things doesn't mean that they're going to be able to do them until they're in fact ready to do them. And what we now know is that when they're 14 in the 9th grade, they've got 15 more years ahead of them of normal, healthy growth and development. And that's, as I said earlier, the human brain is the ultimate scientific authority. If we expect all of our 9th graders to be able to do all of these things that we expect of them, and aren't empathizing with the fact that they don't have the capacity to do that yet, then we're doing something wrong. So I hope this works. There's no video here on this one. There's no audio. So this is the video that I'm going to show it in a second. What you're going to see here in about 6 or 7 seconds is this 5-year-old composite brain become 20 years old. And there's just no denying the evidence of the cortex's growth over this time period. Is that just the coolest thing you've ever seen? I'm going to show it to you one more time, and I want to pay attention to I do have right here. Pay attention to these two strips right here. Those two strips are they're part of our own cortex. Every one of us has them. If we took a piece of masking tape and went from ear to ear on top of our heads, we'd be masking tape covering this particular part of the brain. Can anybody tell me what that part of the brain is? It's okay. It's called the primary motor strip. Think about it. Motor strip. Earlier speakers talked about the role of movement in education. If you remember Piaget at all, you might remember that Piaget's earliest named stage of cognitive development was, do you remember what it was? Yeah, perceptual motor. Perceptual motor. So what you're going to see here is, this is for every one of us, every movement that we do, whether it's walking or talking or running or riding a bike or playing the violin or the guitar or a piano or gesturing or eating or speaking with our lips, our tongue movement, everything is coordinated within the primary motor strip of the cortex. What's amazing to me is that the largest geographical area of the primary motor cortex is designated to the smallest body part. You know what that is? Lips. Because we're always using them. We're always talking and eating and doing stuff with them. And all of the coordination and sophistication and sensitivities associated with our lips require a ton of geography and space on the motor strip. What I want to show you when I show you this video one more time is how quickly those two strips fill in. Because remember, these are 5-year-old children right here. And over the course of the next 10 years or so, that motor stuff starts filling in much more quickly than everything else. Why? Because kids in this study are doing what they should be doing, running around and playing and talking and moving, and not necessarily sitting behind desks in school. Look how quickly they fill in. Didn't go in. Here it is. Right there. Okay. I've lost the slide show. I just want this one. My time? Looking for, it might come up, it might not, but I'll explain it to you. There's a slide that might come up called the Yerkes-Dodson law. It's also referred to as the inverted U-shaped curve. And what it does is that these two psychologists back in 1908, that's over 100 years ago, they graphed the relationship, there it is right there. They graphed the relationship between performance and anxiety or arousal level. And what you can see is that this is true for kids, it's true for us as well, that if we're expected to do something beyond our level of readiness, then we find ourselves in trouble. So what you'll notice here is that performance is optimized at this peak right here of medium level of stress or medium level of pressure. If you don't have enough pressure, you might be seen as inactive or being lazy, and therefore you won't perform optimally. But what happens for everybody, no matter what your age or stage of development, is that if arousal level or if anxiety or if pressure keeps going, then performance drops off precipitously and people find themselves in this zone of stress. And they get anxious and they panic and they're angry and they get violent, either against themselves or against other people. I can guarantee beyond the shadow of a doubt that every single student that I've seen for the last 30 years who's been anxious and depressed and substance abusing and cutting him or herself and suicidal has been living right there. Because in their schools, they're experiencing not just medium levels of pressure, but chronic high levels of pressure, day in and day out. And that means that they are not capable of performing at a level that they're expected to perform. They're trying to perform right there, but they can't. Why? Because their brains just are not yet ready to do that. Try it. I'm going to play a video that we're not sure you're going to be able to hear. Let's see if it works.
I can't really remember the last time I had a chance to go in the backyard and
you hear that?
run around.
School's just so much pressure that every day I would wake up dreading it.
I'm afraid that our children are going to sue us for stealing their childhoods.
I would spend 6 hours a night on my homework.
You have to get into the top schools.
You have to take tests and do interviews.
It's gone way to the extreme.
We're all caught up in it. In America, if you don't earn a lot of money, something went wrong.
The pressure comes from the colleges, from the parents, from the government, but it has to stop.
You have to do well now so you can get to a good college.
Everyone expects us to be superheroes.
You have a fear from the parents that my kid needs to be able to get a job.
How do you expect us to do well when you can't even make mistakes?
You're dedicating your whole life to your grades.
You have to be smart and you have to be involved in arts. I have soccer practice every day, plus the homework on top of that.
Produce. It's impossible. I couldn't cope.
I've gone through bouts of depression just because you feel so swamped.
I almost had emotional breakdown. There have been 6 suicides in our school district.
Our students are pressured to perform. They are not necessarily pressured to learn deeply and conceptually.
But what is that going to mean when we have a whole population of dentists and doctors who've been trained for the script?
Things that actually get our students to think are pushed aside.
These kids come to the table with this creativity and this love of learning. Let's just not take it out of them.
I think the United States really needs to rethink how we do schooling. The economic future of the country depends on our addressing this.
We need to redefine success for kids. It's gotta be something we do together. All of us as a society, almost as a movement.
Jobs need you to be a critical thinker. They need you to be a problem solver.
We need to really think, what does it take to produce a happy, motivated, creative human being?
So I think I'm winding down on my available time. I'd love to keep you here for the next 3 hours, but I'm going to wrap up now. So a couple things. First of all, Doug Fisher was right this morning when he said that some things we do have a harmful effect on students. And so was Roseanne when she said that sometimes what we're doing is not right. When I invited you to connect this morning, I asked you to connect with me, and I hope that you've been able to do that. I asked you to begin thinking about connecting with each other in ways to become more collaborative in making schools a safer and healthier, balanced experience for kids. And I also asked you to think about beginning to empathize with your students on a much deeper level, literally at the level of their own brain development. I hope this has been helpful and provocative and interesting to you, and I thank you very, very much.